Hello, everybody. Welcome to the WorkTango Work Culture webinar series. Really great to have you all here. Apologies for the couple of minute delay, had some technical difficulties, but we've made it on through the other side, and I'll give it a moment or two for folks to dive in. We had over 1,000 registrants for today's webinar, so people are filtering in. We're at a couple of hundred right now. And while we wait, I'd love to just get a couple of housekeeping things out of the way. First off, the slides and recordings will be sent to everyone after the webinar, so we'll definitely do that in short order. And love to get in the chat. Where are people visiting us from today? I'm sitting in Toronto. I know, Deborah, you're in Barbados today, but I'd love to see in the chat where people are from. We got Edmonton, we got Ohio, Atlanta, Philly. It's fast and furious. Love to see the folks that are joining us from all over the world, it seems. By introduction, my name is Rob Catalano. I'm gonna share my screen here as we get started. I'm one of the co-founders of WorkTango. I currently run the strategy division here, and personally, I've been spending, my gosh, the last 18, 19 years in the space of employee experience, building great workplaces, something I've dedicated a lot of my career to. You can probably see it on my shirt here. Improving work lives is something I'm really, really passionate about. So many folks here, I'm noticing from other places as well. The Big Easy, Brantford, again, welcome to everyone. Really excited and passionate to talk about this topic today, how DE&I strategies democratize and support employee success. Before I do introduce our wonderful speaker today, I did want to add a few pieces of color for today's conversation. First things first, if you have any issues or need some help and you go to the host and panelist part and chat, we're definitely can have a few folks here, David and Pat on the WorkTango side, to help support any needs that you have. But we'll also be, it'll be an interactive discussion, and there'll be some times where we'll ask people to provide their feedback in the chat. So feel free to do that. If you do have very specific questions in the Zoom channel, under the Q&A section, you can actually put in questions and answers, and those are the ones we'll be monitoring and looking at and asking questions along the way. Also, one thing I want to share with you. So I know some of us have just met, but I'm going to be your voice today. We want to make this really interactive, as your comments and questions are coming in, I've been given full authority to interrupt and try to ask questions that you might have in your mind. We have hundreds of people on the webinar, and I'll do my best to support all of that. I just wanted to obviously share how we want to make this really interactive today as well. So before I introduce Deborah, I want to add some commentary on this topic. I think it's such a critical topic, and what I think a lot of companies are really trying to struggle and understand and improve in their organizations in terms of these types of democratization of strategies and DEI strategies to build better employee success. And we know when we have that turns into fantastic company success. But it's a really critical topic, and I want to share one concept before introducing Deborah on why. And I think this is such a critical topic for this major point. For much of the population, a majority of our waking lives are spent at work. And this is data from 2015, right? If you actually look at it today, we're probably even more so looking at more work and work-related activities, more than we do sleeping, more than we do any other waking activity. And I think this fact really alone underscores why companies need to make today's topic a critical agenda item. So think about it, right? We all spend most of our time doing work and work-related activities, and imagine feeling judged, disrespected, underappreciated, pressured to conform and behave in a way that's not really true to who you are and prevents you from bringing your whole self to work. And when you don't have that level of trust and transparency where you spend interacting with many people throughout the day, these are many experiences that our employees are going through. And that's why I think this topic is super important and critical. And again, really proud and excited to have Deborah here today. So that being said, I'll introduce you, Deborah. And she's currently the Chief People Officer at Somos, brings over 20 years of leadership experience in so many industries: financial services, telecom, e-commerce, media and technology, with large Fortune 500 companies. And functionally, experience is vast: HR leadership, talent management, business transformation, change management. And beyond just a wealth of experience and wisdom, she's a wonderful person that I've had the pleasure of meeting and getting to know recently. So Deborah, just to round out your introduction, before you dive into your talk today and share your screen, any interesting facts you can share about yourself that we wouldn't find in your typical bio? Anything interesting about yourself, and I'll kind of give you the floor to dive into your presentation as well.
Thank you very much. It's funny, I was thinking through the question, and I've relocated 10 times through work, and many of those times with the same employer in terms of moving around the country. And one interesting fact about that was that in 3 consecutive cities that I moved to, after I moved there, the teams won the Super Bowl for the first time. So for all of you that are out there that are thinking about, Super Bowl and all those things right now, I'm available to move to a new town. So just wanted to share that with the group.
Deborah, I've lived in Toronto most of my life, and let's not get into Toronto sports. It was a very tough baseball fan thing to go through, and if you're a hockey fan, forget it. We didn't even have NFL, but I moved to San Francisco for 4 years, and the Giants made it to, they won the World Series. The 49ers were in the finals, and I felt like if I come back home, maybe it'll happen. It hasn't yet, but hopefully one day I have the same luck that you have when it comes to sports teams.
Absolutely. And I will go into presentation mode here so that we can all share our slides here. One moment.
I'm also seeing people are getting into the Chiefs and some awesome other. The Raptors won the NBA. You're right, Andrea. I digress. We did have some good time in the NBA world. Thank you.
1 second. Just having a little technical difficulty here. 1 second.
No worries. I'm also seeing, some great sports callouts as well. Even the Rough Riders, some CFL going on, and all other sports. But it looks like we can see your screen now, and yeah, you're good to go.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm so excited to talk about this topic. And one of the things that I will try to do is to also demonstrate both the techniques and transparency in terms of my communication with all of you, because that's what I'm asking you to do. So let's start out by talking about the Great Resignation. I know over the last few years, we've all read numerous articles and publications about the Great Resignation. And the primary reason for that is the fact that 85 million workers in the United States voluntarily resigned from organizations over that time period. That's reflective of 50% of the labor force. So in 2 years, those individuals voluntarily elected to move on. Now, what I wanted to share with all of you is that it's important for us to understand why individuals have left organizations, but more importantly, in a moment, I would like for us to flip the coin and look at the other side of this story in terms of the people that chose to stay. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is to drive engagement through transparency, and most importantly, through democratizing the employee's experience. Now, let me start by sharing a little bit about myself. And I'm doing this because I want to have a level of transparency with all of you. So don't laugh at the pictures. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I am from rural Arkansas and grew up in incredibly humble beginnings while in Arkansas. And then later, my family relocated to the Northeast for career reasons for my parents. And over time, I completed my education there and then went on to school at Hampton University, which is an HBCU in Virginia, and then also completed my MBA at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia. When I finished my undergrad, or actually when I finished my MBA, the first position, my very first position was working at a Fortune 100 company in the diversified manufacturing industry. And at that time, my first role was to lead an MBA recruiting program to recruit newly minted MBAs to join the company in preparation for them moving into a new role, leading a P&L for a country within 7 years. Now, this was a very coveted role, and it was actually the vision of our CEO. And he and I worked together to build the program, and he actually even went to each of the top 10 MBA programs in the US and interviewed the candidates himself. Well, I'm sure you can understand why that would be a very exciting opportunity for the MBA students. And within 2 years, we were one of the top employers at each of the top 10 MBA programs and successfully added 20 to 30 MBAs over the course of 2 years to build a strong and robust pipeline of talent. Well, because of the success of the program, I was also asked to extend my recruitment activities to focus on diverse engineers. And we had similar experiences, both in terms of the diverse engineers, but also in terms of interns. And it actually came to the point where other employers in the community would reach out to me and say, Deborah, would you please make your selections early because the students won't accept our offers until they know if they've been accepted by you. Well, obviously that was exciting, and we actually received a national recognition for the internship program as well. Well, at the end of the summer, after my second year of launching the successful program, I was asked to make a presentation to the CEO of the business and to all of his direct reports. So this is the international CEO. And I came in and I made the presentation. I shared our successes. I shared the stories about the young people so that they could understand the new talent that was coming into the organization. Well, at the end of that presentation, the CEO stood up and walked across the room towards me, and he handed me a check. And it was the CEO award that was given to less than 100 people across the entire company, and it had a couple 100,000 people. And I was the only person in the HR department to ever be recognized for this accomplishment. And so I'm looking at the check, and the check was larger than my annual salary. And I share the picture here of my parents because it was larger than their salaries. And I'm completely overwhelmed. I'm shaking like a leaf. And I'm looking around the room and everyone's staring at me, and I'm trying to hold back tears. And I share this story because at that moment and at that time, I recognized that I wanted to spend my career doing HR work. And the reason that I wanted to do it is because I wanted to provide opportunities for every employee, everyone to have a level playing field so that they would understand the rules of engagement and they would understand the playbook so that they could experience the moment that I had just experienced. And so today I invite each of you to join me in this commitment to create a democratized employee experience so that everyone has a level playing field and a level opportunity to be able to create success, not only for themselves, but also for their companies and organizations. Democratization. The way that I define democratization is through the focus is on the democratization of knowledge to provide the acquisition as well as spreading the knowledge across the entire employee workforce. What we're trying to do is through this transparency is the recognition that, first of all, Trust is a critical element of any relationship. So through transparency and providing insights and awareness to everyone, that then we can create a community as well as a shared commitment to the business because of trust. Trust is built through each incremental experience within the organization. So let's talk a little bit more about trust and transparency. Here's some of my favorite apps. We all use these now, as a result of digitalization across various industries. And let's just talk about some of these. So first of all, Airbnb. I would have never have thought that I would, let's say 25 years ago, that I would have considered going across the world to live in someone else's home and to trust that the experiences that were outlined in the description would be representative of what I would find when I would actually get there. Similarly, employees and candidates all over the world, but certainly in the United States and in Canada, have a familiarity and trust in Glassdoor. And what research has found is that candidates are actively searching for information about culture, about the employee experience, about salaries, and all of those things. And they so trust Glassdoor that they do that before they make an active decision to apply for positions. So today, our candidates, our employees, and even all of us have come to expect a level of transparency before we take the next step to trust in building a relationship with those organizations. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was the fact that each relationship, each transaction, each interaction between employees and with companies represents an opportunity to incrementally build trust. Now, the employee journey, which sometimes is called the employee life cycle, is representative of points of engagement from attraction to separation within an organization. Now, let's take a moment to explore opportunities as presented by a model from Deloitte, which outlines different points in the relationship where we can build employee engagement and where we can provide transparency, which can be translated into trust. So here you can see the first area, the first element is meaningful work. Employees are looking for the opportunity to have autonomy and to be able to make decisions about their daily work. The next is around hands-on management. Let's look at the very first one, clear, transparent goals. I know for me, I love to play board games, but I need to understand the rules, right? I need to understand, how do I win? And that's what employees are trying to understand in terms of their goals, and then also in terms of recognition. And if you look at growth opportunity, it talks about the need for self-directed and dynamic learning. They just want to know what they need to do so that they can learn and they can execute and they can deliver, because we all want to experience success. And in the very last area, it talks about trust in leadership. And specifically, it talks about transparency and honesty. So some of you, and probably many of you that are on the call, you're in the HR community, and you're trying to constantly build trust and engagement within the organization. And for those of you that are leaders that are on the call, rest assured, these are all opportunities, because with each of your interactions, you are sharing messages. Hopefully there's a level of transparency and you are building trust. And so these are just examples of where within the employee life cycle that we can actually build trust. So in a few moments, I will ask Rob to give me some feedback from the chat regarding areas within the employee journey where we can potentially build trust. So this is a diagram which explains the different steps of engagement where we can build trust with employees at the attraction stage, in terms of our brand, in terms of in recruiting, providing insight into what they can expect throughout the recruitment process, and delivering on those things and the commitments that we make in the onboarding process. This is where we talk about the rules of engagement, both those that are spoken and unspoken. Learning and development, giving insight into the learning tools that are available to employees and the support systems that are there. Reward and recognition, progression, that's about career pathing. In terms of one of the key drivers around job satisfaction for those that left organizations, it was lack of insight into how they could progress that caused the decision to actually to leave the organization. And then finally, many of these models end with exit. For me, I say retain or exit, because each time an employee elects to move to a new role, to accept a special project, those are all points where they commit to re-engage, to be retained. And so those are all very important steps in the process. So Rob, do you have any feedback from me from the chat or any questions about the employee life cycle and opportunities for transparency and trust?
Yeah, so if there's any great ideas or items in the chat that you've implemented in your organizations, it'd be great to share with everyone on this call. One thing I really like that you mentioned, Deborah, is on the attraction and recruitment side of things. Many people think that people's employment starts at day zero, but it starts at day minus whenever they interact with your organization. And I think when it comes to trust and transparency about the recruiting process, responding to people if they are not going through the whole process of recruiting and whether they're hired or not, I think just that transparency and trust builds that. And you might be hiring for those roles in the future, and I think that's where trust and transparency could really start. There were a couple of comments here and questions about have you ever implemented an entry interview as an example? So interested in that and your thoughts on that question.
And actually, I don't think I'm familiar with it. I don't know if it's a term, excuse me, a term that I'm not accustomed to, but do you have any insight as to what an entry interview is?
I was hoping you did. I wasn't sure if that was so maybe Bryn, if you can add a little more context over there, that would be great. But a couple of the examples coming up are onboarding, sharing as much as possible with the company and product. Some really good comments I hear. I think one of the questions that also came up while we're waiting for these to come in and people to share was that on the previous slide, there was something about time for Slack when it came to the Deloitte office. Any context in terms of what that is?
Absolutely. So time for Slack is basically time to think, right? When we're grinding and trying to get things done, and if there isn't time to breathe, to reflect, to relax, then it leads to burnout. And so time to Slack is really about just time to stop and to give you a chance to kind of get centered and to regenerate energy to be able to continue to work.
Got it. Also, on the point we were talking about earlier in entry interviews, I think based on a couple of the examples here, it's basically an entry interview when you started your role, whether it's 30 days in. I mean, I've conducted stay interviews. Hey, let's not wait to the exit interview until you're ready to leave about what your experience is, but how do you have frequent check-ins and discussions throughout that employee journey to build transparency or course correct? So it'd be great based on that question, if any thoughts on experience with those, how that could work in the process, or any lessons learned in your experience.
Yeah. So thank you for the clarification. Actually, in our onboarding process, we do actually have different points in those first 90 days where managers and employees connect to make sure that there's clarity about assignments, about any barriers that the employee is encountering with completing their work. Also, we have a buddy that is assigned to each person to be a person that can answer those I guess, the unspoken rules that can provide insight to the employee about the culture, things that they're experiencing that they don't understand, but providing it in a safe manner because it's not directly with the supervisor. So those are some of the things that we do to offer insight and to help employees to understand the landscape that they're entering in when they're just joining the organization.
Wonderful. And there's definitely a lot of great ideas here in terms of, onboarding surveys after 30 days, and some other great examples there that are definitely interesting to take a look at if you're on the call. One thing I'll just highlight that you said, Deborah, was just that ability to have an open conversation early on in the process. I think is a lot of what you're talking about, right? From a trust and transparency perspective, how do we be clear about people's experiences and try to course correct that? You build trust just having that conversation versus letting it sit until there's an issue or a problem. So some really good ideas from the team and from your end. So happy to keep monitoring. There's a couple of questions I think I'll try to plug in at the end, or if it makes sense based on your narrative here, but I appreciate addressing the whole crowd here so far.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everyone because it's important that there are two things. One is, one of the objectives is to make sure that you have an opportunity to have actionable takeaways from this conversation. I know sometimes when consultants make presentations, they'll share enough information to get you sitting on the edge of your seat and you're highly engaged, but ultimately you don't have the insight to be able to take action and to implement. And so today, I want to take advantage of the collective genius from everyone that's on this call to share examples so that each of you will have the opportunity to grab something that you'll be able to implement following the conversation. So I want to provide a very specific example of a developmental experience that I had an opportunity to build when working in a Fortune 100 telecommunications organization. And specifically, the challenge was that we were having difficulty filling leadership roles within the HR community. And we were getting asked lots of questions from employees about how do I navigate my career in this organization? How can I prepare proactively to be able to assume additional responsibilities before they're presented? And so I was tasked to actually build an HR career and development model. And one element of it was that I interviewed, because the company had over 200,000 employees. And so I interviewed the top 40 HR executives across the organization. And I asked them the same 10 questions and asked about, their past work experiences, which experiences best prepared them for the role that they had most recently assumed. I asked also about, what skill or capability did you not anticipate that you need now to be effective in your role? Those are just examples of the types of questions that were asked, but also in the spirit of getting employee input into the process and utilizing kind of an agile approach to the development of the model. We asked employees, what do you need? What do you want? What questions do you want answered? So that we would build the tool to reflect their unique needs. And some of the burning questions that we heard from the employees specifically was around, what is the career path? What are the skills or experiences that are needed to advance? What rewards come with advancement in the organization? And what are the available resources to support my growth? And in addition to understanding the need to answer these questions, we also incorporated a feedback loop throughout the process so that we could continue to have dialogue and test ideas with the team to make sure that we were building something that would actually meet their needs. And this was in an effort to support and to provide equal access to everyone with the knowledge about how do I progress within the HR community. Now, we also, I mentioned earlier that we had asked questions of the executives, and I wanted to share a few sample questions here, which are really focused about, what best prepared them for their roles, what new skills did they need that they hadn't previously been aware of, and also, could this tool potentially help them to continue to navigate their own careers? And also, we wanted to make sure that each of the experiences would be relevant. That was really important to them. So the outcomes that came from these conversations was information regarding experiences and the critical skill that had been identified that the leaders had not previously anticipated was around agility. And we'll talk about specifically learning agility. And then finally, the development of competencies. So these three items, experiences, were captured in what we call a hypercube, and I'll share an example of the hypercube. And then in terms of agility, we investigated lots of agility models and identified one from Korn Ferry that supported learning agility, and I'll walk through the details related to that. And finally, the last thing that was developed as a part of this tube was competencies, and specific competencies, both functionally and also in terms of behavioral competencies that were necessary to support the development of HR leaders through the organization. Now, I mentioned the learning agility model. Initially, as I talked to leaders, they were referencing specifically the ability to continuously learn in order for them to grow their skill sets in response to what was happening in the business. And they also referenced people agility, which is around interpersonal capabilities to lead people through change, and an awareness of also how you are impacted as you are leading others through change. And then there was also change agility, which is really about adapting to the changing environment and the changing situations, and being sure to see and focus not on the change, but of the opportunity that the change represented. And then the last one was a drive for results, and to understand that what those results needed to be could change as a result of the situations that you were operating under. So that was the learning agility model that was identified as being a key competency and a very relevant skill going forward. In addition to introducing the model, we also had an agility scale. And this was to offer an opportunity for the candidates to assess where they are today as opposed to where they need to be in the future, so that they could focus their developmental activities on the specific aspects that represented the greatest opportunity for them. And so there's a lot of words here. Don't worry about that, because of course we will be sharing the slides afterwards. But the key issue here with the anchors is that it helps the person to understand what low proficiency looks like and high proficiency looks like. And then they can focus on the development to close the gap between the two. And the next item was around the competencies. I mentioned that we developed functional competencies, which is around the specific disciplines within human resources. And we identified the scale in terms of low proficiency to high, similarly as we did with agility. And then also in terms of behavioral competencies, which highlights how the work is being done as opposed to what. And similarly, we also had anchors and low and high proficiency levels for them to use for both them and their manager to use to assess their current state as opposed to the desired state.
Deborah, I wanted to dive in. Sorry, interrupting
Yes.
before the hypercube. It was just an interesting question. I think was really telling when you talked about that, the maturity model or the agility model. And it was something on my mind as well, but this was a question that came in that was around, how do you work towards correcting transparency when employees maybe give feedback about management that's negative and nothing's really done to correct the behaviors in management teams, whether that's in HR or beyond? You know, this comment said we do entry interviews for new staff, but what about interviews when leadership changes or people that they're supervising them. Oftentimes they're very different people after their first year. So I'd be curious around any comments or thoughts when it comes to, levels of transparency when it's maybe not the most positive feedback, how that might be handled, or other ways to navigate through changes in an organization. And we all know our companies are rapidly changing these days.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a wonderful question, and it kind of speaks to this whole concept. And I'll go back very quickly around agility when we talked about the agility model here. So what happens quite often, I mean, none of us like to give constructive feedback. There is no one that celebrates that moment, right? Whether they're giving it or receiving it, because you're never quite sure how the person will respond, or if they're in a position to be able to accept the information. And so one of the things that's really important is that employees are given the opportunity to, I always ask, how do you think that experience went? What worked, what didn't work? Lead with allowing them to highlight where there might potentially have been gaps or are gaps, and then follow up and provide additional feedback and insight. But when the employee has the opportunity to open the door for receptivity to that feedback, they're more willing to accept it under those kinds of circumstances. So I don't know if that helps, Rob, and if you think that I should give more detail, let me know.
No, I think that was definitely good. And if there's any follow-ups, people can chime in. Actually, another question just came up on that point that I think was interesting. Was there only self-assessment of leaders, or was there only self-assessment or leader assessment as well for the behavioral agilities?
It was both. So there was
Okay.
a leader and a manager assessment, and the two then had a conversation to kind of land on where the person was on the spectrum, or the, I'll say on the spectrum. And then from there, they identified, well, what's the next step above, so that they can incrementally improve the actual skill itself.
Okay. Wonderful. That was a bunch of questions, but I know there's more stuff to share, so I'll let you get back to it.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate the questions, so keep them coming. Thank you. So the next area that I was just about to introduce was the hypercube. So the hypercube was reflective of the conversations that came out of the information from the HR leaders. And out of it, I was able to identify 4 areas where that were common experiences that were shared across all of the leaders. And each one of them represented an opportunity for learning, each of these, and I'll walk through them in greater detail. But the critical thing is this cube presents an opportunity for the employee to first assess the experiences that they've already completed. And then the balance of the cube would then become an opportunity for them to try new assignments and new roles to close the gap so that their cube would be completed. So let's quickly walk through and talk about the elements of the cube. The first is around transitions. Each of us, as a part of our employment journey, we first start where we are individually responsible for our own performance and receive feedback regarding that. As we progress in organizations, there are sometimes then opportunities where you are supervising a very small team. That is when you're supervising others. Then the next transition after that is you become a manager that is managing managers. And you're no longer necessarily directly touching and coaching each person. So you are leading through others. And that is another skill that needs to be developed in order to effectively progress to a more senior level role. And also there were opportunities where the leaders would lead a very specific discipline within the HR community, and that would be a functional manager. And in some cases, when you're the functional manager, you're leading people who have higher capabilities or skills or more depth of experience within that function. And so you have to learn to balance leading, but also following, because you're not necessarily the expert. So that's a new skill that's developed through that experience. And then eventually you could become a leader for a business where you're in the role as kind of the HR business partner or leader for HR, and you're managing multiple functions across the business, compensation, reporting to you, talent acquisition, et cetera. In that case, you may not have had experience in each of the areas of the people that report to you. And so your leadership becomes much more strategic, and you are trusting and managing the functions through very knowledgeable people. So each of them requires a very different level of management capability and acumen to be successful. And so as you continue to grow, each one of those represents a transition in terms of your depth of leadership. The next area is functions. In terms of functions, all of the HR leaders, all of them, had worked in more than one discipline within HR. So these are some examples of the various disciplines that they had worked in: compensation, program management, talent acquisition. They didn't all work in all of them, but they worked in many, which helped to broaden their depth and understanding of the HR function overall and position them well to continue to kind of build additional tools in terms of experiences in their toolkit to allow them to be a more effective leader as their leadership broadened. Structural. This is really about working in various parts of a business. And so working at corporate, working in a divisional office, working in a field operation, or perhaps stepping outside of the HR function altogether as a part of a special project team, or supporting an international business or working internationally. I'm sure we can all understand how each of these would create unique understanding in terms of business acumen and in terms of understanding, when you are in more senior levels, the unique needs of each of these areas within the organization that would need to be responded to. And the final area is around environmental. And this was around the different business, where a business is within their business life cycle. Is it a mature organization? Are you a part of a startup? Are you working in an organization that's growing rapidly, or perhaps a merger and acquisition? As the environment changes in terms of the maturity of the business cycle, there are different tools that are necessary to support each of those businesses because of where they are, and also in terms of helping them in terms of accomplishing their goals and objectives. So what I heard from the leaders overall is that you need an inclusive experience in order to be most effective in the most senior levels of the organization. And so, as I mentioned earlier, each employee was encouraged to look at their own experiences to date and to identify, did they work in a mature organization? Had they worked as a part of a closure? Had they been a part of a merger or acquisition? And also, what HR functional areas or disciplines had they worked in? So they went through and identified those that had already been completed, and they were tasked to then understand, as they look, as each employee looked at new experiences, new job opportunities, special projects, et cetera, that they would be thoughtful about, what gaps do I need to fill within my cube so as to better prepare me for a role as a senior leader in the future. So with that, Rob, I am going to pause to see if there are any additional questions about the cube. The objective was to provide complete transparency about the roadmap to senior leadership, and to give each employee the opportunity to determine what they wanted to do next with this information being available to them.
Yeah, there were some specific questions around any other hypercube experience or examples, and if you think there's any other ones that's worth adding on, feel free, or can kind of go over to a couple other questions here. But see if there's anything else that would resonate as a tangible, experience that you've seen with the hypercube.
Hmm. There's nothing else that resonates, but what I will share is that we actually built cubes for many of the functions, for IT, for engineering, et cetera, through interviews. And we built similar cubes to help employees to understand the options that were available to them, and also how to progress. And one other thing that I will add is progression is not always to a senior leadership role where you're leading people and P&Ls and things like that. We also, on the engineering and IT side, built one to support the development of a thought leadership, perhaps as a fellow or a principal, where you were a thought leader as opposed to a people leader. And so we built a cube to support that development as well, in recognition that everyone doesn't want to lead, and that may not be the way that they can make their most important contribution.
Wonderful, thank you. Not questions specifically about the cube, but I know that there's only a few more slides left, and then we can get into some other general questions.
Absolutely. Okay. So I just wanted to just share a couple other slides because, obviously that the very detailed example that I provided was regarding the development in terms of the HR career path. But other areas, when we think about the employee journey, one of them that is most prominent right now is the whole idea of transparency in compensation. And I mentioned earlier that employees want to be confident that the experiences, which includes the reward systems, that they are highly competitive and that what they're experiencing in our organizations are equally competitive to those that they could experience outside. And also, of course, we know that from a regulatory compliance perspective, many states and in some cases cities are putting in requirements related to transparency in terms of sharing salary grades on job postings and submitting information annually to cities or to states regarding our parity in terms of gender and race and in relation to compensation. So when we asked employees, what do you want to know about compensation? These are the things that they told us. They wanted to understand our philosophy in terms of rewards, and the role that managers and employees should play or could play within this process, what differentiates our reward process and systems and the actual total comp package. How are we differentiated in the marketplace, whether it's within the industry or within our local communities? And they want transparency. They're asking for benchmarks, specifically in terms of how our reward program compares to others. And also, finally, again, this whole issue of parity and compliance. They want to be able to see the reporting. I know Facebook and some other companies a few years back started sharing parity reports within the industry because of the questions that they were getting within their organizations. So with that, Rob, I will pause. I know we are coming up with 7 minutes left, so I want to pause and see if there are any other questions that are out there and to give you an opportunity to close as well.
Absolutely. I actually just posted an extreme version of a transparency in the chat. A couple of companies actually publish all of their actual salaries out there, and it's just another level of transparency. So I'm not sure any thoughts or comments on that, but I guess there were a couple of questions here that I wanted to address. One was there's actually two questions just theming together around best practices to capture demographics of an organization when it comes to recommendations of approach and how often. I know that the topic today is a little bit different than that, but it seems to be in a democratized world. It was voted one of the highest questions, so I just wanted to address it. I'll share in the chat that This is a lot of what WorkTango does, is help companies measure sentiment on DEI, representation of the workforce, and again, we see companies do the measurement of sentiment a lot more frequent than an annual kind of diversity representation look at the demographics. But this is something that would be helpful for a guide for folks. It seemed to have been asked a lot and upvoted. But on your end, just curious on maybe when it comes to measuring some of the activities around perhaps not just representation, but sentiment around transparency and inclusion and equity. Any thoughts on how you've approached that in your career?
So a couple things. One is we make employees and leaders aware of EEO reports and things like that we're required to submit, and we are required to give them access if they have questions or insights. So we're more than willing to share that. And additionally, I regularly, even today, we do reporting in terms of sharing information, transparency with our employees about, we talk about turnover. We talk about, are we experiencing, from a gender or racial perspective, more turnover from one community than another. We're very open about that because we want them to know that we are watching that, and also that we take the messages. We talk about the exit interviews and what we're hearing, and we share that sentiment with the employees so that they know that these are the things that we're potentially hearing, and this is how we're trying to address them. And we do that because we want to not just hear from employees that are departing, but also those that are staying, to understand if they have these concerns and to get their feedback. And you'll see feedback loop is at the bottom of this slide again. It's not just about telling, but it's giving them an opportunity to ask questions and to give you feedback on the degree to which you're being effective in addressing their concerns.
Oh, there we go. Awesome. Thank you. Another, I really liked the question that just came in. It was a bit holistic. I'm really curious in your thoughts, but it asks, how do we as HR continue to remove our own blinders when it comes to understanding what's needed to democratize the employee experience? So the comment goes on to say, I suspect that many people who are not on a level playing field may not feel safe or even see the opportunities to share through typical insights gathering like surveys or focus groups. The trust piece is really resonating, as well as the impact to follow through, but any other thoughts?
Wow. So I think it's a great point, because if you haven't created an environment where trust and transparency are currently available within the organization, it's probably a low likelihood that folks will be really honest. And I think that that's where potentially DEI groups and affinity groups can potentially be a source to help you to work through that, because if individuals have volunteered to participate in those types of experiences with you, that you can utilize them to hear the voices of other customers. So by making sure that you have high levels of diversity within that group, and taking that opportunity to ask tough questions and have tough conversations with them, that could be one way in which you could get additional information. Another is, and I've seen companies do this, where they've invited their employees to actively utilize an external tool like Glassdoor. And they'll do an active campaign to go out and share your feedback, because there's a level of anonymity and other things. And so there's an opportunity to have a listening experience, because they can trust that you don't have access to the information. So that could be another way to kind of democratize even the feedback process.
Wonderful. So I know we're coming up on a minute and a half left. I want to give you, one last comment or takeaway you think would be awesome, and then I'll take us home with just some last few comments.
I think the only thing that I would just like to say is, we will share the slides afterwards, and if there are additional questions or anything, I think my email address is included in there. Please feel free to reach out and ask any questions and give any feedback that you have, because ultimately I'm hoping that we can all be better as a result of this experience. And I look forward to future dialogues in the future. Thank you, Rob.
Wonderful. So, I heard this somewhere, and it says, when it comes to building trust, you're either building it or eroding it. Like, there's no in between. So these are really good reminders of what we can actively be doing in our organizations to build that level of trust in our organization and different layers and parts of the employee lifecycle that we can do it. So a lot to think about, and many other questions that came up that unfortunately we didn't get time to get to. I think that's the double-edged sword of having a big group together, but appreciate everyone's interaction today. A big thank you to you, Deborah, just offering your time, your resources, your experience, and just being open, even offering your email address for people to reach out to you, and definitely a big thank you on behalf of everyone that's here and the WorkTango team for sharing your insights and experience with us. We'll be back in a month or so with another webinar with Jason Aberbrook talking about the future of HR, and really excited to share that in the near future. But a big thank you to everyone. Have a really great rest of the Wednesday and week, and take care.
Thank you. Goodbye from Barbados.